This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Socialism. That's the broad theme of today's show. First, we'll discuss our neighbor to the south, Cuba. How did the adoption of socialist policies impact its economic development? Has the Castro regime achieved some desirable outcomes like improved healthcare, literacy, and lowered inequality? If so, at what cost? Then, on the second half of the show, we'll turn our attention to the former Soviet bloc and discuss reform in the Republic of Georgia. After years of corruption and stagnation, it made dramatic reforms following its 2003 Rose Revolution. We'll explore the consequences of those reforms. My first guest is Dr. Vincent Geloso. Dr. Geloso is a visiting assistant professor of economics at Bates College. He's also a former postdoctoral fellow at Texas Tech's own Free Market Institute. Vincent, welcome back to Texas Tech.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start by rewinding history about 60 years to where Cuba starts before the revolution. It was obviously poorer than the United States then, just like it's poorer today. But how was its standard of living then, relative to other Latin American countries at the time in the late 1950s?
So if you could check their incomes in dollar terms of today was roughly $4,000, which put it on par with some of the richest Latin American countries. It was poor in the United States. It was roughly 30 to 40% as rich as the U.S. So not a rich country, but by Latin American standards, pretty rich, but also in other indicators like life expectancy, well above Latin American standards. Long life expectancy, low rates of infant mortality, very good health indicators, high levels of literacy, urbanization, a very developed country by Latin American standards in 1959.
Okay, and what then were kind of the immediate consequences of the revolution there in terms of impacting the lives of Cubans?
So Cuba's income grows until the 60s and then flatlines for 15 years. It gets Russian subsidies, which boosts it a little. The USSR falls, it collapses, and retakes a little since the late 90s with some liberalization. But if you check this level of income as a percentage of the rest of Latin America, the country keeps falling systematically downwards. So even when Cubans are getting a few more extra like dollars here and there, they're actually not catching up with the rest of Latin America. They're still they're walking while everybody else is running. So it's went from being at the top of Latin America to rock bottom.
And over this time then, the consequences of the revolution, we're all familiar with the Castro regime, and Cuba's socialist. What does socialism mean in Cuba in terms of economic policies there?
So it includes nationalization of pretty much a large number of important primary sectors. It will include high controls on what you can import, important controls on wages and prices. So it's very hard for people to allocate resources, find ways to be entrepreneurs or solve problems. That's why if you walk around in Cuba, for example, you'll see buildings are run down. Buildings have rarely been renovated, largely because there's price controls on construction and price controls on rent. So there's no value in revigorating these types of assets. Plus, you can't import tools from the United States or from other countries, which would make your workers more productive. Combine all these layers of intervention, and what you get is the stagnation I've described a few minutes ago. And Cubans are incredibly poor today.
Yeah, I spent a little while in Cuba, and if there was a theme that stood out to me, it was that the price is wrong, is what it felt like for everything.
Yes.
And it's not that there wasn't prices there, it's just that didn't reflect the real scarcities in the rest of the world because everything internally was controlled and messed up.
Yeah, so they have something called the libretas, which are basically little books that you get. They're ration packs. That's what they are. They're entitling you to a certain amount of resources, and the government gives you at incredibly low prices. But they're ration. You're getting a certain allotment. And what happens in this situation is that Cubans get their basics at this high cost. But everything else that they want to do, they have to go to the black market. And black markets are not cheap to use. They're high transaction costs. They're expensive to find the information. You can get ripped off really easily and not have any recourse for anything. So Cubans are, when you say all the prices are wrong, is that there's this whole entire sector of the Cuban economy that's so informal and it's expensive to use. It makes them a little better off. The black market makes them a little better off relative to the alternative. But it is a costly one to use relative to allowing prices to return to to market levels, to liberalize the economy, and a few sectors in Cuba that have liberalized since the 90s, because after the fall of the USSR, they had to. This is where you've seen the few like little inches of improvement. They've come from the bulk of these little sectors, the few privatized farms, the few private like liberalized trades, and the hotel sector, which is where tourists come from.
Yeah, I appreciated that greatly because I stayed in a couple of the supposed 3-star government hotels when I was there that were just a disaster and run down. But compared to the Casa Particulars, the people who had the incentive, who were renting out their own homes, the upkeep was so much better, and it was getting them a little bit of hard cash too.
Yeah.
But where I saw it not working as well is in the restaurants. They had privatized they had allowed private restaurants, but they were still stuck with the state supply chain.
Yep. Well, that's one of the things. Like when I mentioned the little ration books, the ration books control not only the quantity of food that you have, but also the types of food. So Cubans have access to a certain limited amount of, for example, salt is rationed. If you're a fan of good meats, salt is pretty much an incredibly important ingredient. If it's heavily rationed, it's really hard to try and compete on a margin of diversity of food. So restaurants are basically run by night operation of people who are just trying to scrape by a living. And it's probably better that it's been liberalized. But they're so constrained by other regulations that they're preventing these little entrepreneurs from making something bigger out of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. Cuban food is much better in Miami than it is in Cuba. But, some people, so you think around the world today, there's really only 3 real socialist economies left where the government owns the majority of the means of production. And that's North Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba. And 2 of these one's a scary police state that's a disaster. Yep. The other one's utterly collapsing at the moment. People look to Cuba and say, well, its economic growth hasn't been so good, but, they've done other things kind of good, like literacy and equality and health care. Let's talk about the successes of the socialist regime in Cuba then, starting with maybe literacy and equality.
So literacy has gone up. But there's a reason for that. The government has a virtue in providing education because it shores up the regime. If you're able to provide education and control the content of what's being taught, you're actually shoring up your rule and limiting the chances of dissent. So they have an incentive to produce that. It's not an enlightened outcome. It's an outcome of the state trying to do something. And on metrics of reading, of course, they're doing well. But if you're looking at other metrics deeper down, like outcomes of cognitive development and later life outcomes, then it's not as clear as that Cuba does well. But for that very core basic metric, it does okay. Because the regime has accidentally improved it because it does something and it served another purpose. For inequality, the inequality measures are misleading, largely because we don't have market prices. We're measuring incomes as the government says they are, and we don't have access to the national accounts. We don't have access to the data. The numbers could be heavily fudged. They could be heavily disqualified. We don't have any information to gauge how reliable this is. But it is clear that even if every criticism is potentially there, Cuba is a low inequality country, but it comes at a high price, really low incomes as well.
Okay, so how about the paradox of Cuban healthcare? So their life expectancy is nearly 80 years. It's higher than the United States. Its infant mortality is very low. Aren't they at least being successful in healthcare?
That's probably the one where there's the most reasons to be skeptical of what they're doing. So the regime promotes itself on low infant mortality rates and high life expectancy. When a government starts concentrating on a metric, that metric loses all value because people will shape their incentives to meet that metric. The government says doctors have to know more than that many dead babies. And if you get more than these many dead babies, you're being penalized as a physician. This will alter the incentives of the physician when he reports the statistics. So one way that they do that is physicians will reclassify babies dead between 0 and 7 days, and they'll reclassify them at what we call late fetal death. Late fetal deaths are basically they're dying in the late stages of a pregnancy. By reclassifying these deaths, they're able to kick out many infant deaths out of the statistics, because infant mortality stats start at the moment of birth. Hence, once you correct for that, the level of infant mortality kind of doubles. Depends on.
And what's the evidence that they're cooking the books on this?
Normally, you'll find that countries like the deaths in the first 7 days and late fetal deaths, the ones that occur just before birth, have a very stable ratio because they share the same causes. So if you look at all the countries in the world that have the data that provide the number of deaths of those, they're generally in line. Cuba's out of whack. Cuba has a 6-to-1 ratio of Ds to Ds. Hence, it's a clear sign of manipulation. And not only that, but this is a tool that demographers have used to find that, for example, in Soviet Russia, the data were fudged, and that's the same. And they found the same thing back then. Skewed ratios like that was a sign of fudging the numbers.
And this would impact life expectancy too. That looks long because these are very early births. One other question about life expectancy. When I was there, I noticed, everybody knows the stereotypical U.S. 1950s cars. But there's not a lot of cars.
Yes. So a lot of the other stuff that makes Cuba have a high life expectancy is completely non-related to healthcare. They're accidental outcomes from non-health related policies. So when the government, I mentioned that there's a lot of import restrictions. When the Cuban government nationalizes the production of car, isn't able to keep up with demand, and prevents Cubans from importing car parts from the US or cars from any other countries, well, Cubans are not driving. Car mortality is one of the most important reasons for death. For example, if you look at a country like Brazil, which has 8 times the rate of car ownership that Cuba does, that knocks off nearly a year of life expectancy for men at birth, because those who die are generally in disproportionately younger men between ages 15 to 25. Hence, they knock down the number. They have nothing to do with healthcare. It has to do with another type of related policy. So by depressing car ownership, by restricting imports, they're actually improving life expectancy. But I'm pretty sure if we were to ask, well, I'm not pretty sure, but if we offered Cubans more mobility, the ability to run around the countries, find a better job, mobilize yourself better, or 0.8 more years of life, I'm pretty sure the average Cuban would take the car.
Well, thank you, Vincent, for sharing this perspective on Cuba's evolution and current situation with us. Up next, you say you want a revolution? I would have sung it to you, but believe me, you don't want to hear that from me. Hopefully, you will want to hear us discuss the consequences of Georgia's Rose Revolution when we come back.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeVitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation. Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Robert Lawson. Dr. Lawson is the director of the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom and the Jerome Fullenweiner Centennial Chair in Economic Freedom at the Cox School of Business at SMU. He's also the co-author of the Economic Freedom of the World Annual Report and a connoisseur of everything Georgia, including its cuisine. Bob, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back.
So, first of all, actually, just place Georgia on the map for everybody. The Republic of Georgia, not the state. What is it? Where is it?
So Georgia is sort of north of Turkey, south of Russia, on the Black Sea. Sort of, if you know where Turkey is, it's just sort of up, sort of northeast of Turkey.
And a former part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union breaks up in 91. What happens in Georgia?
Yeah, so Georgia, like all the other former Soviet republics, had a protest against the Soviets. The Soviets killed a few of them in 89, 90. In 91, they declared independence. Immediately after independence from the Soviets, things got very bleak in Georgia, though. The Russians turned off the natural gas, so in the winter they had very little electricity. They had some civil wars in 3 of their provinces, one of which was settled, but 2 of which are still kind of going on. And so for about 10 years after independence from the Soviets, Georgia really suffered. Maybe 1 million people out of the 5 million people in the country actually left the country. A lot of them came to Brooklyn. They live in New York now.
And so then, during that time period, was there very much economic reform, or we think of the fall of socialism? Was there an embrace of capitalism?
Not really. I mean, there was a little bit. Certainly the Soviet Union was gone. The political repression that went with that was gone. Some of the economic repression was gone, but things were still, I mean, you can't get electricity. No one's going to start a business, or a lot of foreign direct investment is going to come into Georgia when you can't get a power hookup. So there wasn't a lot of serious economic reform, unlike other countries like Estonia, which very quickly reformed. Georgia lagged about 10 years, really nothing happened.
And then you get the Rose Revolution, end of 2003-ish. Yeah. What is that?
So the Rose Revolution was November of 2003. A guy named Mikhail Saakashvili is a very well-dressed, Columbia-educated lawyer, spoke very good English. He led a peaceful revolution and became president, and immediately began what I think is the most radical free market reform process that's ever happened in any country in the shortest period imaginable.
Wow. All right. So what were the economic reforms?
Well, the main thing is he hired a guy, and I got to mention Kaha Bendukidze, who died unfortunately a couple years ago. He was the architect that Mikhail Saakashvili hired to direct these reforms. I'll give you some examples. They lowered taxes to a flat tax rate of 20%. There are no other taxes, basically. It's a 20% income tax, no wage tax, no social security tax, nothing else. They privatized like mad. You can go online right now, privatization.ge, I think it's Georgia's privatization. You can log on today, and you can, with your Visa card, you can buy a plot of land, a state-owned business, anything you want, a farm, if it's still in the hands of the state.
Now, this is very different, because I think, when we think of Russia, Ukraine, privatization meant cronyism and, still the nomenclatura becoming oligarchs instead.
In some sense, this was an advantage that Georgia had by going about 10 years after everybody else. They saw a lot of the mistakes that went on in Russia and other Eastern European countries, where the privatization mostly went to cronies. They went to cousins and friends, and it was really a rigged process. In Georgia, Kaha Bendukidze, he says, we're not going to do that. We're going to just auction off to the highest bidder. And if it's a Russian who's the highest bidder, it's a Russian. Now, Georgians don't like Russians, but he said it doesn't matter who the winner of the auction is. The winner of the auction gets the asset. And it was a very clean, open, and literally on the internet. It was all transparent. So everyone would see all the bids, and it would be completely obvious to any observer if a crony who wasn't the highest bidder won the auction, everyone would know about it and they'd get caught.
So you said a word there, transparent. And we both spent time in Georgia, you a lot more than me. But there's one thing that strikes people as odd if you see as a new police station. They're literally transparent and made out of glass for the most part. It's supposed to be symbolic. What's going on with that?
Every police station is glass, and it's a kind of a cheesy, symbol of the new transparency, because the old Soviet or the old Georgian police forces were horribly corrupt. One of the things that they did early after the Rose Revolution is they fired something like 40,000 police officers in one day, because these police officers were criminals. They would stop people on the street, shake them down for bribes, and so now they fired all those cops and they replaced them with new police officers. But they really needed to do a marketing effort to convince the Georgian people that the police weren't these criminals that used to, pillage their society.
Yeah, they fired the police force and crime went down. Right?
Exactly.
So let's actually stick with firing for a second, because that's something that was normal for Kaha to do once he got into this position. It wasn't just the police force.
So Kaha was a force of nature. He was about a 400-pound man, so he was just physically imposing. He was a chemical engineer by training. He was a scientist. He suffered no fools. So he would walk in, he'd pick a Thursday afternoon, and he'd go into a government ministry, and he would ask whoever was there, how many people work here? And they would say, oh, we have 110 people on the payroll that work in this office. And he says, well, how many are here right now? And they would go, about 10. And he would fire the 100 that weren't there, literally on the spot. And so this is not an exaggeration. They literally took the executive branch of the Georgian federal government, national government. They reduced the employment by 90%.
A 90% drop in
reduction. And he just literally fired them. And this took place in about a year, from 2004, basically the 2004 period. Yeah.
Wow. So what happened to unemployment?
Well, initially it went up. I mean, you literally fire 40,000 cops. You go into the ministry of this or that, and you fire, 2/3 or 90% of the people. Unemployment went up in the initial period. But one of the things that Georgia also did is they liberalized their labor markets. Former Soviet countries had very tightly controlled labor markets that they inherited from Soviet times. They had unions and very strict union rules that made it difficult to hire and fire workers. They got rid of all those rules too. So one of the things we've found, if you study Georgia's labor market, is although there was an initial sort of just radical increase in unemployment, there was also a lot. People were able to get jobs more quickly as the private sector firms developed.
So when we kind of sum this stuff together of the reduction in taxes, the reduction in the size of government, the liberalization of the labor market, the privatization, you are the co-author of the Economic Freedom of the World report. How does this all net up and stack in terms of economic freedom in Georgia?
Sure. Well, in the most recent edition of the Economic Freedom of the Report, Georgia was 6th out of 159 countries.
Sixth in the world.
Sixth, higher than the United States. Now they're still poorer than the United States because they're poor, but in terms of economic freedom, the freedom to buy, sell, exchange, import, export, hire and fire, all of those sort of rules and regulations, they are absolutely more free economy than just about everywhere else in the world.
If we dialed this back to 1990, they're obviously very, very unfree, but you couldn't even measure them back. Where have they done since the Rose Revolution to 6?
Yeah, so numerically on our 10-point scale in the Rose Revolution, they would have been about a 6 out of 10, and now they're about an 8 out of 10. So in statistical terms, this is sort of a 99, it's unlikely that this would happen by chance, like 99% statistical significance. This is a huge jump. No other country in the world it comes even close to jumping upward as much as Georgia did over the last 10 years.
So you recently completed a study looking at what the consequences of these reforms are in terms of outcomes. What did you do?
So one of the challenges with this is that Georgia radically reformed, and most other countries didn't do it the way Georgia did. They did it more gradually, slower. This was like this radical. The metaphor is they took a pill. They took this crazy free market pill, and we want to know what impact the pill had. Now, if this was a medical kind of context, like literally taking a pill, you would want a control group. You would give some patients the pill, and other patients you wouldn't give the pill. So what we did in our study is we created a control group. We have Georgia, they took the pill, and then we have a amalgam, a group of other countries that are similar to Georgia that we treat as a control group. And then we compare how Georgia did, they took the pill, and we compare how Georgia compares against this sort of fake Georgia, which is this group of other countries that are similar.
So in terms of economic growth, income, what do you find?
Yeah, so what we found is that, most countries are getting richer, and the comparison countries that we have in the control group for Georgia, they got richer, but Georgia got richer faster. It's about a $3,000 gap now. So Georgia's still very poor. Georgia at the beginning of the period was something around $5,000 per person, which is very, very poor. And now they're about 9,000. So, and their comparison group was like 6. So the gap has widened between Georgia having taken the Rose Revolution pill and the synthetic Georgia.
But an extra $3,000 per person when you're only starting at 5 is massive.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a huge increase.
So what about other things? Not just incomes, but did the rich just get richer and that's pulling the average up? What happened to inequality?
Yeah, one of the great worries, and I've been to Georgia 15 times, and you can actually see inequality sometimes. You know, when I first began visiting, there weren't a lot of very nice houses. Now when you look on the hillside, you'll see these extremely mansions, So some people are clearly getting rich. And one of the concerns that Georgians have, as Americans have, is that there's growing inequality in the country. And you do see that. The inequality data that we have for Georgia show that since the Rose Revolution, Georgia has become more unequal. But the interesting thing is, so are the other control countries. Everyone's becoming more unequal. I mean, whether that's good or bad or what the causes of that's a whole separate discussion. But the fact of the matter is, Georgia hasn't become more unequal than you would think it would have been had it not done the Rose Revolution.
And does this translate then well into other quality of life metrics too? Have you looked at things other than GDP and inequality?
Yeah, data are really hard to get because we need data for the 90s, and the 90s was a very rough period for Georgia, so we don't have a lot of data. We do have data for life expectancy and for infant mortality, and both of those show that Georgia has outperformed its comparison countries. Infant mortality especially has dropped a lot in Georgia, and a lot more than it would have done, or we think it would have done, had they not done the Rose Revolution.
So they've made the radical reforms. They're now in the top 10. And in our last 30 seconds here, tell us a little bit, as they were leaving power, they left a constitutional amendment there to try to preserve this. What is that? What are the prospects going forward? Just last 30 seconds.
Yeah, they have a law called the Law of Economic Freedom. I think it's a translation, but it is a radical constraint on the government. Their government spending is limited to, I think, 30% of GDP. Their debt is limited to 60% of GDP. Deficit's 3%, and they can't create any new taxes unless they take it to the voters.
Wow, that's hopefully locking in some of these reforms that have had this effect. Thanks for sharing this with us today, Bob. Appreciate you coming back.
Good to be back.
On today's show, we discuss two countries who once had similar socialist economic systems and, for that matter, similar levels of very low income, but since have radically diverged. While Cuba has remained socialist and stagnant in its economic development, the Republic of Georgia embarked on some of the most radical free market reforms the world has seen in the last 20 years. As a result, Georgia's become dynamic and growing and is starting to prosper. Meanwhile, Cuba is stagnating. Ultimately, Cuba needs some radical reforms like this too if they're going to grow. Of course, the path to reform is going to have to be driven by Cubans. But the United States policy towards Cuba certainly isn't helping any. We've had an embargo for a long time with Cuba and seen no institutional change there. Perhaps if the United States started trading more with Cuba and traveling more, it might help spread the ideas of freedom so that they might start on more of a process of reform too. We'll see you next time.